got to get your water, this is your chance to do so with minimum disruption. Yep, that's you. But also feel free to go back and forth. It is a lunch roundtable. We recognize that people will be eating and that it may be your chance to eat in the day. So don't feel that you can't do that. Again, thank you to everybody for coming. And thank you especially to the Chileanist historians that we've invited to come and to help us to open this moment to reflect on 1973. Many of you were with us on the 11th at Andrea Mitchell Center, where Arturo Valenzuela and Peter Ciaveles, whose name I may have just mispronounced, were able to present. So if this is the second time you're joining us to mark the 50th point, the 50th year after the coup in 1973, thank you for making that space. I want to introduce our presenters. I want to let you know that this will be structured with 2 rounds of them responding to questions, and then there'll be time for a more generalized conversation. Heidi Tinsman is a professor of history and gender and sexuality studies at the University of California, Irvine, where she teaches modern Latin America, the transnational Americas, gender and sexuality, labor, race, and world history. She received her doctorate at Yale University and is the author of multiple things, including Buying into the Regime, Rapes and Consumer Politics in Cold War Chile and the United States, as well as Partners in Conflict, The Politics of Sexuality, Gender, and Labor in the Chilean Agrarian Reform from 1950 to 1973. Heidi's most recent work focuses on masculinity and Chinese contract labor in 19th century Peru and Chile. Edward Murphy is an associate professor of history at Michigan State University. He also teaches Latin American history with urban studies and anthropology. He received his doctorate in the anthrohistory program at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and his research has focused on mass urbanization and inequality in Chile, including during the country's dramatic changes from socialist revolution to neoliberal reaction. He is the author of the book For a Proper Home, Housing Rights in the Margins of Urban Chile, 1960 to 2010. He has also served as managing editor for Anthrohistory, Unsettling Knowledge, Questioning Discipline, which I actually have currently in my office. If you want to stop by, you can read it, as well as the title, The Housing Question, Tensions, Continuities, and Contingencies in the Modern City. Camilo Trumper is an associate professor of Latin American history at the University of Buffalo, SUNY. His first book, Ephemeral Histories, Public Art, Politics, and the Struggle for the Street in Chile, was out in 2016 from University of California Press, and it was awarded the 2018 Latin American Studies Historia Reciente y Memoria Best Book Award, along with other accolades. His current book project, Writing in Dictatorship, Politics, Exile, and Archives in Chile, 1973 to 1990, explores practices of writing and the experience of everyday forms of power and contest under Pinochet in Chile and abroad. He earned his PhD from the University of Berkeley. We are very glad to be able to have done an event that for us is somewhat unusual, where we're asking scholars to be in conversation with one another about their own research, but also about their research in the context of this overarching question: how can our generation begin to asumir, right? Begin to really take on our historical role as interpreters of the end of the Cold War, if it has ended or not. We wanted to ask them to take this question in 2 rounds. First, to address, and we've asked them to be short, and I'm going to be timing them, so I'll be passing them notes that seem rude, but there's a reason for that. We've asked them first to reflect on the impact that 1973 made on them as young scholars as they were beginning their research and their careers, and then also to ask them to reflect on the way that it reverberates for their work in the present. Please join me in thanking them for coming. And I believe that Heidi, you're going to kick us off.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Heidi. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Anne, for putting this together and to the Latin American Studies Center.
I forgot to say something.
Oh, yeah.
I am so sorry. Okay,
She'll thank the people.
I apologize. It's kind of important. We are able to open this kind of very meaningful space in our academic lives and in a busy institution only because people who did not have to do so stepped up to try to help us organize the funding for this event. Those people include, of course, the Center for Latin American and Latinx Studies, and I want to particularly thank Kathy and Amanda and Julia for all the work they did. I also want to thank the Lauder Institute, which is part of the Wharton School of Business and which stepped up as part of an area history program that they run to recognize the importance of this event, and the Department of History, where we currently are. So it was extremely wrong of me to forget that. The final thing to note is that the idea for this roundtable did not come from anybody on the faculty, but came from graduate students in the history department who wanted to acknowledge the 50-year mark and who understood its significance. So particularly, thank you to Javier, Zoe, and other graduate students in history.
Yes, thank you, graduate students. Best ideas in my history always come from the graduate students. Okay, I'm gonna respond to Anne's question about the impact of the coup on my early research, kind of as an intellectual biography that will mark my age. My introduction to the coup really happened at the same time as my conversion to Latin American history as an undergraduate in 1983. I was shown or was assigned Patricio Guzman's documentary, The Battle of Chile, a 7-hour extraordinary film. And it was assigned in my Introduction to Modern Latin America class taught by Michael Jimenez, a historian of Colombia. And that film documents in a painful way the incredible sabotage wreaked upon Chile by the United States and the tragic revolution from within of the middle class and the bourgeoisie, the military, against popular unity socialism. This was the early 80s, right? The coup, what happened in Chile in '73 was really tied in on American campuses anyway with what was going on in Central America with Ronald Reagan. And, most activist conversations and academic conversations were really focused on the role of the US. The US, supports big business, extractive industry, and then goes in there and does what the hell it wants to with, the military. But Patricio Guzman's film is a lot more complex than that. It really pushes back. It focuses on the middle class and their response, their fear of mobilized working class people and poor people. And Michael Jimenez himself said, you've got to study the middle class and you've got to study, working class sensibilities as well. So that stayed with me, a kind of pushing back against US, authorship of everything. And then at graduate school, I read Peter Wynn's Weaver of Revolution, which also really sidelines the US. Yes, of course, the US played a significant role, but the most important roles come from within Chile. Peter's book narrates the crisis as driven by the tension between the revolution from above and Allende's effort to carefully control the creation of a socialist society and the expectation of workers, also divisions from within popular unity, the ultra-left, ultra-left socialists, Marxist Christian Democrats, and the revolutionary left, MIR, and really pushing, armed revolution and seizure of assets in ways that undermined, in many ways, Allende's ability to say he was governing from above. Wynn's book also said, pay attention to what workers think. Their beliefs about what they want are different than political leaders or those in the state, right? Those I took with me. Finally, I would say an important impact or an important influence on me in relating the coup to the history I wanted to do was women's studies and the incredible flourishing of gender history, Joan Scott's important work, the American studies, revolution in gender, and thinking about the connection between gender politics in the family, calling that politics, and how that influences state and workplace politics, and the importance of Latin American feminists critiquing the limits of socialist projects, the failure of socialist projects to really follow through on supposed commitment to women's emancipation. Also a robust literature by Latin Americanist feminists on the state's role in modernizing patriarchy. You can see all of those influences in my first two books. In the agrarian reform book, I take a deep look at the Christian democratic agrarian reform as well as the socialist agrarian reform. The thing about Chile in the 60s is that the center and the left, they agree that property has to be radically reorganized. And in hindsight, what's surprising about Chile in the 60s and for the long 60s isn't that there's a military coup. It's that there was a political culture that believed it was possible to expropriate 50% of private farmland, mobilize 250,000 peasants into unions, and tell them to be political activists and expect there not to be a civil war. I see the conflict, the September 11th conflict, very much driven by, dynamics endemic to Chile, particularly the absolute opposition of the Christian Democratic Party to working with Allende's coalition, despite the fact they shared a vision of radically reorganizing society. This is also often the the tragedy of the United States, right? That some of its liberal projects are pretty radical, but in no way will it consider cooperation with Marxism, and certainly not a Marxism that calls itself democratic. The other major thing in that book is, there isn't just class conflict in Chile. It's not just about the workers versus the middle class and the elites. There is a major class conflict within the working classes, within peasant societies. They are mobilized by Christian Democrats, by socialists and communists who are saying move slow, do what the president says, and then Mapu and the Mir who are like, whatever, seize everything, tell the Marines to rise up against their commanders. There is bitter animosity among and within campesino communities and working class communities, and that has its urban corollaries as well. Finally, as you know, if you've read the book, I argue that peasant women support the agrarian reform. They support radical politics. Not all women in Chile are out there banging pots and pans and asking for the military to put on its pants and overthrow Allende. In my second book, yeah, great, thanks, 2 minutes. But nonetheless, women are marginalized, absolutely, in the radical projects of both the Christian Democrats and the socialists. There is very much a modernization of patriarchy. Women are uplifted, they're mobilized, but they're not members of unions. They're not political protagonists in the same way. They're not invited to be, and this will really make them more vulnerable to that political conflict. In my second book, Buying into the Regime, on the proletarianization of rural women under dictatorship as grape workers, I also maintain this skeptical look at, well, the US does what it wants in Latin America. I argue that the economic miracle of fruit exports was not the child of the Chicago boys. It dates to the early 20th century, a long cooperation between the oligarchy and the Chilean state, developing exports. In fact, exports of fruit really get off the ground with the agrarian reform. It's Frey and Allende who start a national fruit export plan. And, plenty of fruit exporters are protected from expropriation. Also, the property owners, middle-class businessmen and more elite businessmen, they didn't need the United States to tell them that they wanted to dismantle the welfare state or that they wanted a different kind of state. It's not that there's no state under neoliberalism. There is a state, but it's a different state. But the military is, going to leverage the agrarian reform for its own purposes to also marginalize the oligarchy and say, we're going to invent a new, more competitive capitalist Chile, et cetera. All those things matter. Two other things that are in that book that make me think about the coup, I'm finishing, or whatever the influence I think about the coup is I talk about the contradictions of neoliberal capitalism for women. Access to salaried employment in a market society gave women more leverage in their families, and it makes women protagonists in the labor movement in peasant communities for the first time. And women are going to play roles in pro-democracy movements because of their integration into capitalist economies. And finally, consumption is not simply a tool of domination. Consumption was a key place where working class women reworked patriarchy and also came to critique the regime. So I'm still pushing back against that image of all women are banging pots and pans against Allende. They're all on the right. So.
Hey, we didn't talk to each other beforehand, but we have an incredibly similar narrative arc and way of talking about this. So at the risk of being very repetitive, I will say some of the things that kind of follow what Heidi said. Thanks as well to Anne. Thanks as well to the students and the Center for Latin American Studies. My introduction to Chile and the coup really came in the mid-1980s when I was a young teenager. I was very influenced by Amnesty International human rights campaigns and things like that, soundtrack that included like U2 and the Police, and later New Song movement in Chile and stuff like that. When I was an undergraduate in the early 1990s, I read testimonials, human rights reports, novels coming out of Latin America that dealt with the experience of the coup and its aftermath. I also was very taken first by the image of the coup and its aftermath, but also by the image of Pinochet in the early 1990s, who remained the commander-in-chief of the army and also was a senator for life. And he seemed to be emblematic at that time of generals who were receding from power, but very much remained important in the political scene in these countries and rendered democratic transitions very fragile. I don't need to go into the ways in which that built on many of the ways in which Chile was already very emblematic of much of what happened in Latin America. But of course, that's also true. And the kind of infamy and fame that Pinochet had was something that was especially pregnant in the fact that in overthrowing Allende, this elected socialist who ruled democratically, and still it's very important to emphasize, largely without repression, also clearly with a role of the United States. Pinochet was kind of the figure of Latin American dictatorships and the turn towards authoritarianism throughout so much of the region in the 1960s and 1970s. So given this, I was inspired to seek to join my voice to some of the larger work of human rights campaigns and survivor networks. I too sought to say, quote unquote, never again to the singular form of radical evil that exists when political adversaries are brutally violated by dictatorships and their uses of the sovereign powers of the state. My engagement with Chile thus preceded my research interests, driven by the sense of being part of a larger cause to document and denounce authoritarianism and its intolerable forms of violence and victimization. And this was actually very important in my first trip to Chile. In 1994, I went not as a scholar, but I worked as a counselor with drug addicts. I was beginning, however, to read some critiques of Chile as a model for neoliberalism. Much of what I saw confirmed much of what was in those critiques. This included the fact that low-income urban Chileans, who I'm going to call pobladores, which is the Chilean nomenclature, they had very high levels of unemployment and underemployment. They had onerous debt burdens, and they also suffered from very intense mental health problems. They lived in this highly segregated city, vastly different access to services, and the post-dictatorship's reliance on technical expertise and public-private partnerships and social welfare policies poorly channeled discontent and democratic participation. It was also clear to me, even before I became a scholar, that the dictatorship had contributed to these dynamics. It had repressed, marginalized, organized labor, while contributing to a broader process that made work more flexible and insecure. It had also taken explicit policies of what it called poverty eradication, which we would think of as urban renewal, wherein they systematically removed low-income former squatters from downtown Santiago and wealthy areas of Santiago, creating, or I should say, reproducing but also creating a new kind of urban segregation in the city. Finally, it was quite obvious to me, and it didn't take very long for me to get to know families that had directly experienced the forms of political violence. I also quickly came to discover that the kinds of political violence that the dictatorship committed, and especially things like wholesale raids of neighborhoods, happened particularly in these areas. Pobladores disproportionately suffered from the kinds of violences that we know, that we most associate with the dictatorship: disappearances, torture, deaths, and these kinds of things. What I found was that pobladores were this very atomized, demobilized group, and they lived in these very segregated and troubled living conditions. This was brutally brought home to me by some of the children that I worked with, some of the teenagers that I worked with who had, while high, cut themselves, and then in therapy sessions had talked about doing this because of the fact that they felt as if they had no one to trust in the world, that they had no one to rely on, and that they had nowhere to channel their anger, and that this was sort of inward. I returned later to Chile as a doctoral student in anthropology and history. And now I'm working on housing movements and policies from the 1950s to the 2000s. And this image of a depoliticized urban precariat suffering in the long shadow of the dictatorship continued. And there were a few things that deepened this for me. First, I did, like Heidi, I looked at the intense mobilization before the coup. This included the fact that about 14% of Santiago's population, numbers are very rough here, but nonetheless, about 14% of Santiago's urban population had taken part in urban land seizures between 1967 and 1973, establishing hundreds of communities that remain to this day. That kind of intense mobilization was just not present in the 1990s when I was there. It was also the case, as I said, that activism directly contributed to the reaction of the dictatorship and the demobilization of some of that kind of activism. Something that was also very present in the 1990s was that the Concertación, the coalition that led the transition, did not recognize the fact that the dictatorship's repression was often disproportionate among particular groups. And it also sidelined mobilization among pobladores and other popular groups. So far, So far, I'm pretty much within, thinking about these things in the ways of in solidarity, denouncing the dictatorship, looking at the dictatorship as a singular break. However, I did come to problematize that. And a lot of these things are repeat some of the things that Heidi said. So I can be rather brief with this, but let me mention just a few. First is that I too began to see the political subjectivities of pobladores in the urban poor as much more complex. One, I also was very influenced by an article that Heidi wrote called More Than Mere Victims, where I didn't want to look at them as simply victims of the dictatorship and its violence, but also recognizing very much that they had certain forms of agency and voices that needed to be taken into account. I also found very conservative views among many people that I worked with. This included heteronormative images of the family. Those images, ideas, and gender ideologies of the family were very much a part of emerging critiques of 20th century state formation in Chile and Latin America more broadly, in addition to ways in which people had begun to criticize some of how victims of the dictatorship had often reinforced this image in the iconic symbol of the mothers of the disappeared. Beyond that, I also began, so this was a questioning of the sort of subjectivities of pobladores, and one thing I also found was that uniformly the people that I spoke to spoke about the moment that they became homeowners as something that was before and an after in their lives, a clear break in their lives, but a moment of tremendous pride. What does this mean? Especially when Pinochet had said along the lines of, we want a country of proprietors, not proletarians. And I began to think about that then in terms of breaking down the coup and the dictatorship as a singular break, and particularly in trying to deepen my understanding of what we might mean by the subjectivities of the urban poor. And here, one change for me was simply to think about these subjectivities as not neoliberal in the valorization of property homeownership, but rather liberal. And then this opened up a realm for me then to think about areas of the pre-coup. I got 1 minute? Okay. This opened up a realm, or my
Sure.
time, okay, sorry. This opened up a realm for me to think about areas of the pre-coup as more complex. Social mobilizations that themselves were ones that were entangled with kind of liberal subjectivities, liberal forms of state making and these kinds of things. And then also allowed me to have, I hope, a better way to be very particular and precise about the kinds of violences that the dictatorship left behind, about the forms of neoliberalism that do have very particular impact and power to today, but also need to be particularized and recognized in their specificity.
You up go first.
Yes, video.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for fascinating interventions. You'll see a lot of similarities. I think because of the influence that both Heidi and Ed have had on my work. I'll be repeating a lot of this, but I think there's a connection there. Thank you to graduate students, and thank you to everyone for being here. Okay. So Anna's asked us to consider how the coup shaped our early research and writing. I took this as an opportunity to talk about an origin story. It's origin story, then realized that actually in fact origin stories, both personal and political. The crux of my story lies somewhere within that seeming division between the personal and political, a tension that continues to raise uncomfortable questions, apparent paradox that animate my research and writing, and a couple of which I'll share today in these initial comments. I am the child of Chilean exiles, of permanent Chilean exiles. I grew up somewhere between Canada and Chile, a childhood that I've come to see as one defined by displacement, one that exists on the porous border between places, between identities, and between ways of seeing. I turned 5 in Costa Rica, 6 in Toronto, 7 in Santiago, 8 in Toronto, 9 and 10 in Concepcion, and so on. You get the point. Our family identity toggled relentlessly between exiliado and retornado, Chileno, Canadiense, without inhabiting any of these comfortably. My own identity was shaped by the paradox that these shifts implied. Could I be born into an exile from a place that was never fully mine? Could I return to a place I had never originally known? And for me then, the fracture of the coup, filtered through the prism of displacement, was always present from the beginning. But it was also part of a rich and textured familial history that always overflowed the neat boundaries of a coup as a singular event, as an aberrant event. We are repeating or recalling some of that in Heidi's comments. But this was my history, or was it history? More accurately, this question is a way of saying that it took me quite a bit of time to recognize my personal experience as a communal one, and my history as a product of a broader history that I could study, that I could write. I soon learned that doing so, that this project would mean grappling with more apparent paradox, more uncomfortable questions, many of which haunt me today, continue to haunt me, and a couple of which I'll share in an attempt to have them haunt you as well, but productively. So the first question is, should we write a history for the present? A history that is informed by the coup and by its afterlives, shaped by but not neatly encompassed or contained by the chronologies and the narratives that center the coup, that end or begin with the coup. How can we write a different history, one that recognizes continuities and ruptures, violence and persistence, enclosures and exiles? Second question follows the first. If so, how? How do we write this history? How do we, as historically minded scholars, broach stories that are shaped by years of enforced silence, of structured absences? How do we approach a past for which we have had to build our own radically multidisciplinary, multifaceted archives? These questions and some of my early answers to these questions started to come together in a series of what I now think of as small epiphanies, but when I had them were just more troubling questions, and which all came about when I started grad school at Berkeley, often in surprising moments. The first, to echo Heidi, is watching Patricio Guzman's early documentaries. The Batalla de Chile, Yeah, please. And specifically, sections of La Batalla that were reproduced in Guzman's later Memoria Obstinada. La Batalla begins with the bombing of La Moneda. In Guzman's hands, this becomes a synesthetic experience. Credits roll over block, the hum of Air Force jets encroach on silence, and then a shuddering of rockets will erupt alongside images of smoke and fire. From here, Guzman unravels a history of the Popular in everyday images taken with a camera held in the hands of Jorge Mula, who has later disappeared after the coup. The film itself is smuggled into exile out of Chile and edited in exile in Cuba by Pedro Chastel. It begins with a coup as rupture, but paradoxically does not necessarily end there. It unravels a history that Guzman will continues to explore for decades. This image was the one that inspired me, but the subsequent image, the second one, is one that really sort of got my sort of thoughts moving, and that is this odd sort of lyrical scenes of sort of everyday life in Chile under the Popular, filmed by Mulet on the street in Chile of a man pulling a cart through the streets in this sort of poetic, almost sort of fluid, synesthetic way, in front of walls covered with graffiti of people going through their everyday lives. Thanks, that's great. And this is what I'm most interested in. Trying to understand the connections there and the everyday ways in which the personal becomes political and vice versa. Particularly in my first book, how practices rooted in ephemerality, honed in democratic exchange on the street, buttress and sustain a vibrant form of citizenship that uses ephemeral ways that are often quickly erased, but whose erasure and the ease of that erasure sustain clandestine forms of organizing under dictatorship. This is the history of a coup as process rather than as event, and as a process that unravels into multidisciplinary, multifaceted ways of understanding politics as gender, as identity, as subject. Thank you.
Go round again.
And that's for you guys. I feel very comfortable now that I stopped having to be the rude and uncomfortable person. Only because, may I say, you asked me to. I was asked to do that. I'm very comfortable if you want to. Oh, what?
We did okay.
You did.
We
great.
followed orders. We were like the Communist Party during the
Exactly that.
following the revolution from above.
I better start leaving now. So I'm very comfortable if you want to go around again and add some things and reflect on one another, or I'm gonna let you be in charge now.
Okay. Well, I'll reflect on the second question you gave us, which is, how does the coup reflect what I'm doing now? I haven't changed my opinion that the, single greatest force resulting in the coup was the unwillingness of the Christian Democrats to cooperate with Allende, and they turned their back on democracy. They shut the Congress, literally. Patricio Aylwin shuts it. They plot with the military. And the agrarian reform, I think, was the single most important policy of the 20th century in Chile. It gets rid of the traditional oligarchy. But I am working on the 19th century right now. I'm writing a book about masculinity and Chinese contract workers in Chile and Peru during the War of the Pacific. Chile's War of the Pacific is very akin to the US war on Mexico. It annexes a huge swath of territory that makes Chile what we think of as Chile. The mineral wealth, the copper, the nitrate, the emergence of the radical working class and the Communist Party, all thanks to the War of the Pacific. It's driven by the military, and a bunch of things are going on in this project, but it relates to the coup. In leaving the Cold War and looking at the 19th century, I've been invited to think more seriously about the long authoritarian traditions in Chilean Republican democratic politics. There is a long valorization of the military, its heroic role in making Chile in the War of the Pacific, its role in governance. It occupies and runs Peru for 3 years, and those institutions will be transferred to the state of Chile. All kinds of valorization of the military as national patriots, often filtered through various lenses of, racist superiority vis-a-vis the neighbors, etc. But also, other historians, Veronica Valdivia, Brian Loveman, Elizabeth Lira, have been working for a long time looking at documenting, the very authoritarian traditions of Chilean democracy. Chilean democracy is not some uninterrupted democracy until 1973. The military intervenes all the time. Some of the most progressive constitutions and labor laws happen under military or after the suspension of Congress. The Congress is closed frequently. The left is repressed and tortured. Often presidents rule by decree, including by emergency security measures that allow the military to run large swaths or zones, all of this before Pinochet. In fact, Allende relied on many of these decrees, including military-run zones in building socialism. So, what Brian Loveman called the architecture of dictatorship goes back to the 19th century. There's also, the military is anti-oligarchic. Carlos Ibáñez wants to use the state to, sideline the traditional oligarchy, but he's, virulently anti-communist, right? Violently so. Parts of the Popular Front governments of the 1930s and 40s, very famously, and González Videla will persecute violently the left, all while promising, this vision of, a better life for the working classes and an emboldened middle class. So I've really come to appreciate how long-standing authoritarian practices are within, the constitutional democracy of Chile. And one of the most exciting areas of research on Chile and by Chilean historians today is on the military. The military as political actors, constantly involved in politics, constantly. And also the connection between the military and, upward mobility and class formation. The military is a vehicle for poor people to become middle class. And, and they do. And they often have very anti-left sensibilities as a result. The military plays a foundational role in the founding of the Socialist Party. The Air Force founds it. So anyway, it's ironic that a gender historian is kind of ended up working on men and war, but that's what I'm doing. And I still, again, it's the Christian Democrats' fault. Had they civilian politicians, the tragedy of civilian politicians turning their back on democracy in the name of supposedly saving it. That even more than the military is what matters. But I do think we as historians need to take seriously studies of the military and, of the various, anti-lefts. I'll say anti-left more than right? Because, I'll leave it at that.
Maybe it's ironic, but perfect that a gender historian is taking up the banner of masculinity and nationalism. Quickly, just one thing I'll say, I did recently complete an article on the social uprising in Chile in 2019. I'm not going to talk about this very much right now, but I did just want to mention that I was trying to think about it in terms of some of the long-term trajectory of the left. There was I have an image of a mural that I included that was in front of the National Library that talked about violent moments in Chile and in Chilean history, and had the coup, but then placed a series of other moments. And I won't go into what all the specifics were, but joining a growing academic community that has been pointing to these things for a while. So that was gratifying to see that there seemed to be that kind of understanding. I wanted to, okay, I have maybe 3 minutes now to talk about two projects, but I wanted to just quickly mention two projects that I'm working on right now. One is called the Via San Luis, from the Socialist Housing Project to a Neoliberal Ruin in Santiago, Chile. And it looks at this massive housing project that was originally designed in the 1960s, a modernist housing project for 70,000 people that was going to be in wealthy Santiago, and was a kind of left centrist vision for how to integrate the city. At the time, it was partially completed when Allende came into power. And Allende, as part of his policies of redistribution, had 6,000 squatters from surrounding areas come to live in this area. One thing that happened, however, is that from 1976 to 1980, the vast majority of those squatters were systematically evicted from the Via San Luis, making way for military officers. You've just given me something to think about in terms of the way in which this is a part of military officers and their upward mobility. Many of these pobladores actually went to live in the houses that those military officers came from, which were on the outskirts of the city in poor areas. Now, in the 1990s, a shady deal allowed the military to profit handsomely from this. And the Via San Luis was sold. Eventually, parts of it went into becoming ruins. But this is now the wealthiest real estate in Chile and some of the wealthiest real estate in all of Latin America. This all happened in an $800 million deal in 1998. The final building, however, remains from this, and it remained as a ruin, and it is now going to be a museum. And I'm currently working with people who were evicted, who literally stopped bulldozers with their bodies from destroying the last building in order to make this a memory site. Okay, now what's important about this project, other than the fact that it tells what I think is a rather compelling story. One, this is very exceptional and emblematic of the kinds of things that Allende tried to do. It was the sort of vision that he had for what he could do, but it was also something that ended up being quite exceptional, and that he wasn't able to do these kinds of projects in other places. Second, as I think I've made clear already, this is very emblematic of the kinds of urban restructuring that happened under the dictatorship, including the unleashing of finance capital connected to this. Lastly, what I want to say about this is that the conflicts over this last building reveal a very important way to think about human rights and memory in the post-dictatorship, in that human rights abuses have generally been understood in the post-dictatorship through the lens of the very specific kinds of forms of bodily harm committed by state agents. This is part of a larger process that Sam Moyne and others have pointed to, by which human rights became more constricted in its understandings by the late 1980s and 1990s. This, however, is opening this up to think about other forms of abuse, how and in what ways this might be understood in memory in the dictatorship. It's also something that is opening up memory sites in Chile. There are a number of museums, memory sites, detention centers, torture centers that are now memory sites in Chile. However, there is not a single one of these that exists in wealthy Santiago. So this would be the first. So it has these very important ways in which it's opening up the domain of human rights, and also kind of the specific sorts of economic harm and injury that came out of the dictatorship. I have another project that's on how pobladores got access to electricity, deals with privatization, people getting electrocuted, and all kinds of other things. But I won't talk about that now. Maybe it'll come up later. I will hand it over to Camilo at this point. So, yeah.
Thank you. So I'm fascinated by this process that begins, small, personal, and now it's expanded out from the 19th to the 21st century. In part because it seems to me that all good history is communal history, right? A collective project that, and I think you can see the connections between our works. That's where I sort of take a moment to just sort of acknowledge that the conversations that we've had over reading and writing have been really influential to me. we have the genealogy of Guzman and Peter Wynn and Calderon and all these other of our colleagues, but also when I was in grad school, 2001 HHR number came out with pieces by Heidi and Tom Klubach and Elizabeth Hutchinson and others that really foregrounded the relationship between urban, labor, and gender histories. And it was, it shook me, right? And it really influenced how I see some of these things. And made public I think a conference proceedings where you wrote a piece called A Place in the State. I talked about Tomas de Terreno and really theorized Tomas de Terreno, and it really made me think about other forms of Tomas. In this case, my case, Tomas de la Calle, Tomas de la Padere. He's Tomas of public, taking of public space, claiming of public space as a critical act. None of my work then builds on my colleagues. I hope interesting, because you guys are very interested in me as and continue to do so. So my current work is on the history of writing in dictatorship, and it takes this kind of broad and theoretical approach to writing. I'm thinking about different forms of inscription and how those forms are entries into a public dialogue, a form of citizenship, a form of contestation that takes place in a number of different arenas. From writing in incarceration and detention, writing by disappeared folks and others, writing in the schoolhouse under dictatorship, writing in the street, forms of writing that take forms that are often obscured and semi-public, fleeting, etc. Building on my first project on bathroom stalls, on the streets where folks take and signify existing words, no mas, etc. Often in everyday forms that are taken up and become emblematic forms of performance art, like the No Mas by Gala in the 1980s, but are also personal forms. And we'll stop here. This is, I've talked about this before, Heidi's heard this, but this is a piece that we found in my grandmother's things after she passed. And it was part of the No campaign that led to the plebiscite that toppled Pinochet. It's done by my grandma, who used to smoke in a cajetilla of matchbox. Thank you. Where she has written no in pen and then outlined it in her lipstick, right? And this to me is part of an archive of precisely these kinds of practices, right? That connect to democracy, that are about citizenship, are about a public sphere, even if they don't necessarily circulate in public. And it's also my attempt to then fold in a history of writing that ranges from incarceration into exile, and folds exile and retorno into the national history of Chile. Some of our greatest, most encyclopedic works of Chilean history don't grapple with exile, and I think we need to. And so in a sense, we'll fold this back to the original question of origins. Right? I think we can think about our personal archives, our personal stories as part of this collective project of history writing. So that's what I'm doing, writing from history of incarceration, street writing, schoolhouse writing, childhood, etc., exile, and finally thinking about archival practices as a form of writing. And here, your colleague Juan has been actually it's really instrumental in how I'm thinking about this as a form of collective writing as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much, all three, and I will keep a list of names, so just catch my eye and we'll open it up to more collective conversation. So start with you. Please introduce yourself, where you hail from, and then
Sure. My name is Alexis. I'm from the Spanish department, and this topic is fascinating to me. I have been working on it for many years. So I'm very glad of listening to you. And I have a couple of questions that are also my questions regarding my research. I mean, first, I want to connect with what you said at the beginning about how to write history. And the question about method or orientation. Because sometimes I feel when we approach the coup, we make it in an episodic way and not thinking as a structure. And I'm trying to think about the coup beyond the coup. And now that you mentioned Guzman so much in this talk, I'm thinking of, for example, El Botón de Nácar, when Guzman shows how time overlaps. When we think about materiality, territory, dispossessions. So how do we place, for example, the legacies of empire in different moments? For example, indigenous extermination, the Salitre era, the concentration camps, but all of them as something that collapsed together with the coup, you know? It's just a question about time. And also how do we place the coup beyond a national scale, you know? For example, how as a Peruvian, which is in my case, or a Mexican or American, read this as a milestone into political history, but also geopolitics. Thinking now that we are in a post-state era almost, in which the state is a corporation, but also we're thinking about the transnational, the transgenerational, etc. That's the first thing. And very briefly, the second, I will shut up, I'm sorry. It's like the question about women and maternity, because I feel like we have two positions right after the coup. The Pinochetista women, you know, for example, when they try to put in jail Pinochet, they resist so much. But also we have the Mujeres de Calama that are searching for the bodies, and also with the narrative of family, working in two directions. So how do you read this, you know? And also with the estallido social, where the women had an important role. Thank you.
Do you want to take several questions, or do you want us to do one by one? Let me decide. One by one. Okay.
Questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I'm just going to sort of agree with this. I mean, Guzman's work is interesting as a kind of corpus, you know, how it's changed over time as well. And I was thinking about that, but also Nazario por la Luz, right, which is all about time and layering, and it really forces us to rethink, our assumptions about chronology, temporality, etc. I just want to highlight that there are a number of scholars in Chile writing works that add to Heidi's list. I'm thinking of Alfonso Salgado, Marcelo Casals, Camila Gatica, younger historians who are broaching this kind of long, largely 20th century history of violence in ways that both collapse and expand our understanding of these things. And I'll just end with a sort of nod to some of Ed's work also, that on the other hand, I do think that sort of other epistemologies are doing similar work from other places. And I think estallido is a fascinating one, right? You know, the very lema, you know, no son 30 pesos, son 30 años, is a critique of the concertación and its continuities with the dictadura, right? And in that is already a historical sensibility that challenges us to rethink some of these sort of easy dichotomies. So I think approaching this question from different angles, different disciplines, etc., is I think a good place to start.
Sounds like you have a terrific project. It's really great. And I think Camilo's call to think about the coup as a process, authoritarianism as a process, rather than, whatever just a structure or a series of events, is really gives us a capacious framework for thinking of things. And I also like the notion of colliding historical times. Although the historian in me will also say we must not be teleological. There was nothing inevitable about the coup. It could have absolutely been avoided, and it wasn't. And but it does it taps back into other moments of violence and valorization of authoritarian rule. On gender or maternity, well, you nicely just illustrated that maternity can be deployed in multiple ways, right? Both to call the military to put on their pants and be men and oust the Marxist, or basically as moral indignation against the terrorist state for disappearing loved ones. Although that's not the only gender formation for women that we see during dictatorship at all. We see women asserting gender identities within the politics of authoritarianism and anti-authoritarianism as workers, as students, women in exile, feminists, poblador women who's, they're forming ollas comunes and yelling for bread, liberty, and a roof. We could say, oh, they're lobbying for family concerns. And it's a radical critique of neoliberalism, right? So we see, and there were other things available to women besides maternity to mobilize around before too. And I think it's important that we pay attention to those. The big slogan of the 1980s is democracy in the house and in the street, and in the country. That makes a parallel between, the violence of patriarchy and the violence of military dictatorship. And, there are all kinds of critiques of whatever women's relegation to maternal sphere that are embedded in that. And, the Mayo Feminista, the huge uprising by women in 2018 that pre-staged the big uprising nationally in 2019, that comes out of decades of feminist and women's movement mobilizing.
Just to build on that last point, I won't say much more on the maternity question, but I think that also treating the question of these sort of heteronormative understandings of the family and their dominance, treating them historically, when and how they matter, for whom and in what ways, for what particular people, treat them intersectionally, but also to be very aware of all of this is happening with emerging strands of feminism that begin to become much more powerful within the left. And as you said, it kind of has its kind of biggest expression in 2018. They're central to the social uprising in 2019, but they really did. They were one of the most important actors in terms of changing some of the frameworks that I was talking about in the 1990s of this sort of kind of demobilization that was happening, and then being able to work with other groups in this really spectacular fashion in October 2019 and kind of taking over the streets. So I think that those things are very important. I would also, I agree with things that we've been saying about rethinking temporality. I think that for me, in some of my introductory comments, I was thinking about how the coup and its aftermath did carry this particular narrative of solidarity for me, but there was also kind of, I think, a political and ethical imperative there, right? To think very seriously about the kinds of victims and violences that came out of the coup and its aftermath as a kind of process. And I think that one of the things that is very important there is that, yes, we need to, potentially decenter some of these perspectives. Yes, we need to think about authoritarianism as a long-term process, but also that there is this very specific way in which this is playing out in the Cold War. And I agree very much with Greg Grandin, who argues that the Latin American experience with the Cold War, he focuses more on Guatemala, but the 1973 coup is very much a part of this, that this is a part of a kind of counter-revolution that's, really achieved at the barrel of a gun, in which a series of reformist and revolutionary projects across the region are pretty systematically pushed back. So there is a sort of like specific way in which I want to take the coup very seriously as this particular event that creates these particular kinds of victims, that creates this particular sort of historical process, at the same time that I'm also looking for ways to think beyond it. And I think it's really important to consider this in a kind of dual register.
I mean, you already talked a little bit about this during your answer, so maybe just very briefly. I don't know if you saw last Tuesday the statement by UDI. UDI is one of the right-wing parties in Chile. One of the main things of that statement is they're trying to put this discourse of that the coup was inevitable. Because from there, it's very easy to jump to it was necessary, right?
Absolutely.
And I was very shocked when you say, when you first talked, you said, speaking about the agrarian reform, if I'm not mistaken, you said you cannot do this and not expect civil war. Mm-hmm. So I'm just wondering what is sort of this idea of inevitability?
Yes, inevitability. Yeah. I do not believe the coup is, and nothing is inevitable. I mean, and one of the things we do as historians are look at the contingencies that, you know, produce particular events. So I will rephrase my statement about, you know, I mean, I think what's amazing about Chile is there exists a political culture, not just on the left, but also the center in the 60s that believes in radically reorganizing private property. So it's not surprising that there is violence, you know, in response to that. However, it was definitely not inevitable. Part of UDI is, you know, I just got back from Chile, as did Camilo and Ed, and you know, the Cold War is not over in Chile, that's for sure. It's like front and center, and you know, the right, the constant qualification, apologism for the coup and for 17 years of military dictatorship. That, you know, well, the left did this, the left caused crisis, blah, blah, blah. It's like, I mean, the historical record is clear. The sabotaging of the economy was done by the Chilean right and Chilean Christian Democrats. The decision to like carry out the coup had specific actors within the military and within the political parties in the opposition, which included Christian Democrats, that absolutely made the decision to turn their back on democratic process. If you want to get rid of Allende, there were a lot of different ways to do it. Allende had a plebiscite planned for September 12th, the next day, on his entire regime. It incorporated military into his cabinet. He was up for re-election in 1976. You know, there's all, you know, maybe popular unity socialism would have gotten trounced in the next elections, you know. But so UDI is, again, that move within the Constitution. And unfortunately, for those who don't know, the new constitutional process in Chile, the right has veto power over the process, and they're trying to put in all kinds of things that basically, you know, validate the coup. Yeah. So
What about the agrarian reform?
I think the agrarian reform was absolutely foundational to actually modern Chile today. You know, the military doesn't give back the land. It gives back, you know, some properties that were seized. Pardon me?
They do.
No, they don't. They give back less than a third, and most of that land were small and medium-sized properties seized in the last few months. 2/3 of that land is parceled out to campesinos and sold to entrepreneurial investors, and the military state absolutely backs export policies for fruit. They are happy to see the traditional oligarchy gone. The traditional oligarchy is they are shocked that they don't get to go back to dairy subsidies, wheat subsidies, all these things that the state used to do for the traditional oligarchy. They are absolutely shocked. And there's a kind of coup within the coup to get rid of the military that kind of wants to support the old order. And, you know, Pinochet, you know, the Pinochet's alliance with neoliberal economics is about creating a new kind of business elite. So yeah, no, the agrarian reform is central to the restructuring of agrarian society. It undertakes the, you know, structural adjustment that allows the boom of the fruit export industry and also forestry to take place. I mean, Allende and Frey had done the dirty work, the hard work of seizing the land from traditional aristocracy and proletarianizing labor, getting rid of peonage, replacing it with salaried labor. Military doesn't go back to latifundia, it doesn't go back to inquilinaje. Now, it's no longer committed to social justice, and it is violently repressing, you know, workers' efforts to organize, but it doesn't return to the old days. It builds on the success. It agrees with Frei and Allende that Chile's agriculture needs to modernize and needs to export stuff to make money for the Chilean economy. So, yeah.
Just a quick follow-up on that. When in my archival work, I was reading documents that were published by the Ministry of Housing and Urbanism, and around late 1974, 1975, I started to read a lot of documents by landowners who had had their land seized, and they were writing in kind of with these repeating the sort of talking points of the dictatorship. I too celebrated the the true independence of Chile on September 11th, 1973, and the glorious work that the armed forces has done to, control the chaos that existed in our country, of which the seizure of land was such an important part. You need to know, however, Señor Ministro, that my land had been taken over, and I have not received any compensation for this, nor have I received any word that I'm going to be allowed to have my land back. And they either weren't answered or they were told no. There were a few cases where this wasn't true. Now, I would add on to that one thing that does happen is that some of the old elite, in addition to new financial interests, are able to, sort of make money hand over fist in the new investment environment. And I know you weren't saying anything so different, but it is very important to recognize that there is a new kind of class dimension that's very important here. There's a new kind of inequity that's forged, a new elite that becomes extremely powerful. And in no small measure, they're doing this in the new kind of industries that exist in exports, not just in fruit production, but also in many things that are building on things that the sort of state had sort of forged and made possible through infrastructure projects and other things before. But this includes in the forestry industry, this includes in salmon, and it also includes in radically remaking the cities and these places where now these new, and sometimes not so new, elite in Chile are able to invest in all of these new exports, in addition to the kinds of restructuring of the urban environment they're doing. And you have in the late 70s and the initial sort of boom of investment, just this radical remaking of downtown Santiago and other cities in Chile as a part of this kind of unleashing of finance capital and the creation of these new kinds of business conglomerates that become really dominant and today are incredibly wealthy and are very much a part of the reason why the country is so inequitable.
Javier, and then Julia, or is this just a follow-up on that? Go ahead.
It's a two-finger on this discussion, which remits me to a comment made earlier by Haiti that sort of, kept sort of unresolved in my head. So it's a good way of going back to that. So part of Haiti's presentation, you mentioned that neoliberalism in Chile wasn't about the Chicago boys, but I'm thinking about just these two answers, yours, de Belen, as well as Edward's de Belen, and it's it's like an enlightenment moment, because this is precisely what we didn't have in Argentina. We had a dictatorship 3 years later that was very similar in a lot of ways, but did not create this new business class. It played back to the interests of the old agricultural class, and perhaps it's because we didn't have an agrarian reform, but
big time.
But also because we didn't have the Chicago boys. I mean, we did not have anything similar to that. Martinez Dios wasn't that. I mean, the ideological way in which economic policy was done in Chile, I think, is very peculiar to the Chilean case, explains this process that you, Shad, described in terms of the formation of a new business class, and that makes it quite different nowadays as a market economy from the rest of Latin America. There's no another country in Latin America that has the type of market economy that, and a state actually, that Chile does. So I just wanted to highlight that there is certainly something about the Chicago boys, even if we want to look at domestic causes.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that the Chilean economists who were trained in Chicago in the 60s didn't matter, or that, Sergio Castro and, Piñera get to remake things as they want. Of course, they're important. What I'm saying is that the export, what historians do is we push back against like the Naomi Klein idea that like whatever, shock therapy originates in the United States and then it's imposed on Chile. I mean, that's just not the way it happened. That's not what the historical record shows. I mean, Tom Plubach's work on forestry, which begins in the 19th century, shows this continuity between, Chilean state efforts to build export economies. And if anything, he shows continuity between Allende and Pinochet when it comes to that, right? So that's important, and that it's not, and that also there's lots of other boys, and they are boys involved. I mean, the ag export of both forestry and fruit. I mean, forget about Chicago. It was the California boys. It was the Wisconsin boys. It was the Cornell boys. It was the land grant colleges that, I mean, this taps into Amy's work, you know, that the kind of liberal promises, you know, of, you know, getting rid of latifundia, aristocracy-based, inefficient economies and building democratic capitalism, you know, are part of welfare state and socialist projects that then also, many of those tools then under a military regime committed very much to neoliberalism. I mean, absolutely matter. So I agree with you, but I do think we rely on the parlance of the Chicago boys in a ways that replicates US domination of Chilean decisions and ignores the long history of the Chilean business class and the multi-sided nature of the business class. There's old, inefficient, never care about turning a profit oligarchs. And they're like kick-ass businessmen who are like selling stuff all over the world, you know, starting in the 20s. I mean, so.
Yeah, but you had that all over Latin America after the 1930s and certainly after 1945. And you know, again, the comparison with other cases, I think is very illuminating because there is something different that happens during the Pinochet period that doesn't happen in any other dictatorship. Think of Argentina, think of Brazil, think of Peru, think of Bolivia. Yeah. None of them do, and all of them have a period of export-led economy, sometimes very aggressive and very successful, as is the case of Argentina after Prevish policies in the 30s and after Perón in 45. So I think if we look at the region, we see that Chile stands out during this period, and a lot to do has to do with Hayek. I mean,
sure.
not who implements his ideas, but
I don't say that that's not important.
Yeah.
But I actually stand by my thesis that it's, you know, it's more complicated than just, you know, the Chicago boys. It has to do with a longer history of the relationship between Chile's business class and the state that didn't begin with the dictatorship. And I think Chile's business, the history of its capitalist classes is different than Brazil's and Argentina's. And of course, the dictatorship in Chile was 17 years. And although Brazil's was longer, there was much more ideological continuity across programs under Pinochet. So I don't know, there's so many factors, but I agree with you very much that Chicago, you know, whatever, that the Chicago school of thought anyway, that builds on other US liberal projects as well, you know, is at work in Chile in ways, you know, that are unique and that continue today for sure. Javier.
Thank you all. My name is Javier. I am a student in the history department here. My question is related to your answer to the first question. And it is, okay, you have disclosed the complex scenario before and after the coup. And that's very important, but that weeks we have been thinking about the coup.
What have you been thinking about?
We have been thinking about the coup, the 50 years after the coup.
Yeah.
Why is it important to think about the coup today, especially when we see, for example, in Chilean newspapers, in Chilean just political environment, how the coup has become an element of politics of memory, how have been treated during the last years. For example, I was reading this column about this never again, just turn back to never again, socialism, never again, other kinds of forms. So why is it important to think about the coup today, after 50 years? Or if this becomes something very problematic, do we have to take another directions? Or just to think about the history of the commemoration of the coup itself in the last 50 years?
Sure. You want to go first?
No, please.
It's a very Camilo question.
Yeah.
I'm happy to answer.
No, I mean, I think there's many, there's many things to say. I mean, I think I was trying to point out in my comments that many of the things that I had kind of taken for granted as a break, many of those things are right, and there is, I think, especially today, in thinking about the rise of particular kinds of authoritarian movements. I do think Chile is very instructive in terms of not looking towards, Nazi Germany or something else like that is the sort of emblematic example of how to think about dictatorships and authoritarianism, but rather to look at a place that has a long trajectory of democracy, but also has latent within it, and also has forces within it that have often been authoritarian. That's a much better place to think about where the fragility of democracy, where we can judge the fragility of democracy and where we can judge when it can break down. The other part about it, I think, that's so complicated, though, is that, as you say, it's a particular event that enters into memory and particular narratives of the past in particular kinds of ways, right? There's a reason why we're all sitting here, and I'm gratified that we have so many people here talking about Chile. But there's a reason why we're talking about Chile and 50 years from the coup, because it itself, the commemoration of the event is itself an event. To what degree is the commemoration of the event, creating new understandings, new narratives of the past that speak to our present moment, the particular kinds of conflicts that obscure how we might understand what's happened in the past. And I think maybe part of what we're all trying to do as the panel here, and I won't speak for you all, but it seems to me part of what we're all trying to do is to say that there are ways in which the narrations of the coup have also obscured some things, right? But that is not to say in any way, shape, or form that the effects that come out of the coup and the dictatorship are about authoritarianism, that are about this particular kind of authoritarianism that puts, for me, the kind of like Hannah Arendt kind of radical evil of putting bodies in particular, it's subject to the absolute sovereign power of the state. Those things need to be taken absolutely seriously, but also then the more subtle ways in which authoritarianism works and in which it can be defended. I think all those things can be reflected about. And finally, looking specifically at the period of the Allende, Heidi points out, the Christian Democrats probably could have acted very differently. And had they acted very differently, it's very possible that you wouldn't be sitting here talking.
Yeah, they've done what Camilo, what Silva Enriquez, the Archbishop of Santiago, told them to do.
Yes.
Cooperate with Allende to avoid war.
Right. And I do think there's lots of other things you can reflect upon, right? What is it that, are there ways in which certain sectors of the left push things too fast, and in particular ways that were too radical? I think that's an important open question. I will concede that. I also think it's really important to recognize the particular ways in which democratic institutions, in which democratic cultures can become broken down. How and in what ways things can become so polarized. How can you still maintain a sense of the possibility of radical transformation within the context of the ways in which our democracies work? These are all really important questions that I think the coup inspires and make us think about. We were thinking specifically about our intellectual trajectories, which in many ways, it's good that we came a week after the coup because we're all these historians who were sort of reflecting on the coup and its aftermath, but also trying to problematize it, right? Yeah, exactly. But those would be some openings that I would say for your question, right? And again, I would go back a little bit to this idea too of a kind of dual register of really taking seriously what it is that the coup brought into being. What are the kind of dangers that we can see from that? What are the forms of radical evil that we want to make sure never happen and we can mostly all agree upon? And then second, okay, so let's also look at the coup as an event that's narrated and in memory that has all of these different afterlives, that's ways in which we conceive of it, the particular forms of good and evil that we come attached to it, the particular kinds of subjects that we often attach to it. Those things need to be taken, those things need to be problematized and understood in different kinds of ways. Sorry to be a little long-winded, but yeah.
I wanted to ask Camilo to close for us. I recognize that people have to be somewhere else at 1:30, but.
I'll close quickly. I want to sort of gently reject the premise of the question, right? I don't think we're actually looking at the before and the after of the coup. I think what Ed is modeled is we are context, we're doing what historians do, which is discipline of context, right? We're understanding the coup as part of this broader set of processes that move in different ways, not teleologically. We're questioning some of the frameworks of analysis that I think come out of understandable role of eventizing the coup has, and we're trying to find other ways of seeing things that add and enrich and some in that story sometimes in contradictory ways, right? So one of the things that we haven't done, and this will just end with a question, is you have three folks who look largely at Santiago and the regions around Santiago, with Heidi being
I don't look
I
at
know.
Santiago.
With Heidi being the exception, maybe, but the who looks different from the perspective of other regions, other peoples, Mapuche communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We can recognize that while holding its very clear missive to be concrete about and all those things, and also questioning the ways in which we commemorate. We can do all those things at once, and it's not before and after; it's all around.
I'm so sorry for this. I'm not a historian. I work in cinema media studies. My name is Nicola Gentili, and I'm from Italy. I was 14 when the coup happened, and I grew up including the Christian Democrat in Italy. And next to Fidel and Salvador Allende became a hero. So on this discourse of inevitability and also make a parallel what's happening right now in the different scale, which is the war between Russia and Ukraine. I really grew up in this sense of anti-Americanism. Thank you. It was very revelatory for me, this conversation about the influence or the importance of the negligence of internal factor, internal parties, etc. But what was the role? I mean, 73 happened 11 years after 62. And my question is, what was the intervention? What was the war response to it? And continue to your question about how can we avoid a repetition of this kind of phenomenon? What was the war responses towards that? And
Towards the Cuban Revolution?
the war response, the war response about what happened. For someone who grew up really with this very strong sentiment of, oh my God, another hero is very young.
It's so funny because one of my questions was the martyrdom question, so I thank you. I want to just invite people who would like to stick around for a few minutes to come over and stick around, including yourself. And also, if anybody is free at 4:30 p.m., we will have a smaller gathering with our presenters at the Center for Latin American and Latinx Studies, which you would also be welcome to stop by. So thank you to everybody who I realize may need to leave, but those of you who want to stay a few more minutes, I invite you to come up. Thank you to everybody. There's nobody right after us in the room. The question is, what was the world response to it? No, I think we'll get it to clarify. They had a little trouble understanding your question. What was the world response to the coup in the context?
Yeah, that we're very interested to see the US, especially, the sort of executive branch of the US government. I got create a coup. First is kind of all the effort to keep Allende from being in the problem. My own perspective, that explicitly attributed to dividing. They did things like media outlets also.
No, I know, but I just want to make sure.
Yes, why?
Okay, yeah, I'll be like.
That were some sort of disinformation. Why not very they also supported. Okay. That they really, in addition to some other things, but had a huge role in undermining the success of the museum projects, but also contributed to the conservative environment, contributed to the kinds of protests that were taking place inside of Chile,
Yeah, complicated.
conflict, polarization on the grounds, all of which were the kinds of things that plotters said as justification for them on the power. It's not the case that it was like secret back either CIA particularly brought it out step by step.
US did not like they did in Guatemala.
Yeah, right. But there was a process where they very much because it's a very toxic.
European,
So yeah,
European business interests are afraid